He grabbed her by the arm in front of the entire mess hall and told her she didn't belong there. Not quietly, not as a private correction between two people who happened to disagree. He did it loudly, with the full weight of his rank and the full confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told that his confidence was the problem. The sound of his voice cut through the noise of 200 people eating lunch, and one by one, conversations stopped. Forks went down, and the room contracted around the two of them the way rooms do when something is about to happen that everyone can feel. But nobody is named yet. She didn't pull her arm away. That was the first thing people noticed later, when they were trying to reconstruct what had happened. She didn't flinch, didn't look around for support, didn't do any of the things a person does when they're surprised and overwhelmed. She just looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked at him. And whatever Sergeant First Class Aldrich Bowen saw in that look, it was not what he expected, because his grip loosened slightly before he'd made the conscious decision to loosen it. Her name was Staff Sergeant Claire Vega. She was 31 years old, and she had been stationed at Canadian Forces Base Gagetown for 11 days. Nobody there knew who she was yet. That was about to change. Gagetown in November is a specific kind of cold, not the dramatic cold of the Rockies or the wet cold of the coast, but a quiet, gray, bone-settling cold that arrives without announcement and stays without apology. The trees along the St. John River had given up their leaves 3 weeks earlier, and the base sat in the flat winter light with the utilitarian patience of a place that has outlasted every season it has ever encountered. It was not a place that impressed easily. Neither was the woman who had arrived there 11 days ago with 2 duffel bags, a transfer order from Fort Bragg, and no explanation anyone could find for why someone of her background had been sent to an exchange posting at a Canadian infantry training facility. The explanation existed. It was just classified at a level that made the base commander's eyes go carefully neutral when he reviewed it, which told the people who knew how to read him everything they needed to know about what it contained. What the personnel file showed was this: Claire Vega, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, 11 years of service, marksmanship instructor, certified advanced combat trainer, 3 operational deployments to locations the file listed with codes rather than names. The decorations were listed without narrative. The commendations were listed without detail. The file was, in the specific way of files that have been carefully edited by people who know what to remove, full of the shape of things it wasn't saying. What the file didn't say was that the last range qualification she had conducted before this posting had produced scores that the supervising officer had submitted to his chain of command with a note that read, simply, verify equipment. Nobody had found a problem with the equipment. She had arrived on a Tuesday, signed in without ceremony, found her quarters, and spent the first 3 days doing nothing that attracted attention. She ate in the mess hall at off-peak hours. She ran in the mornings before anyone else was on the track. She attended the mandatory orientation briefings with the patient, unremarkable presence of someone who had sat through a great many briefings and long ago made peace with the format. It was Bowen who had noticed her first, which was in some ways appropriate, because Bowen noticed everything that moved through his training environment and categorized it immediately. He had been the senior range training NCO at Gagetown for 6 years, and in that time, he had developed a taxonomy of soldiers that he applied with the confidence of a man who believed his taxonomy was complete. The American exchange posting was, in his read, an administrative gesture, a cross-training formality. He'd had exchange personnel before. They arrived with different procedures and accents and left having learned that Canadian winters were worse than they'd prepared for. He had no particular hostility toward Vega. He simply assessed her, the way he assessed everyone, and filed the assessment and moved on. The assessment was wrong. He would discover this on day 11. The incident in the mess hall was not the first friction between them. It was the 4th, if you counted the small calibration errors that Bowen had been compiling since day 3, when Vega had quietly corrected his zeroing methodology during a group instruction session in front of 8 junior privates. She hadn't done it with hostility. She had done it with the flat, factual precision of someone who knew the correct answer and saw no reason to ornament the knowing. That was, in Bowen's experience, worse than hostility. Hostility he knew how to handle. Quiet, accurate correction from someone he outranked was a different category of problem. By day 6, he had concluded that she was either arrogant or oblivious, and he had landed on arrogant because oblivious people generally didn't perform the kind of unconscious spatial awareness she displayed at all times. You noticed it, if you knew what to look for. The way she positioned herself, the way her eyes moved without moving her head. These were not the habits of someone who had learned them. These were the habits of someone who had needed them. He didn't know what to do with that read, so he set it aside. On day 11, the mess hall was full. It was 215 hours, peak lunch, the room running at its usual organized noise. Vega was at a table near the east wall with her tray, and a field manual she was reading with the focused inattention of someone who could eat and process information simultaneously without managing either badly. Bowen came in with 3 of his NCOs and saw her there and made a decision that he would spend a long time afterward understanding. He walked over. He stood in front of her table. He said in a voice carrying enough to reach the surrounding tables, "The exchange personnel briefing on cold weather range protocols is mandatory. You missed it this morning." She looked up from the manual. She had the kind of face that was difficult to read quickly, not because it was blank, but because it moved through responses at a speed that required attention to follow. "I didn't miss it. I was at the range. The briefing was at 0800. I know. I read the briefing material at 6:30 and went to the range to verify the protocols against current conditions." She said it without inflection. The wind variance off the tree line on the northeast corner is different from what the briefing document accounts for. The document was written in August. Bowen looked at her for a moment, then he reached down and took her arm, not roughly, but with the deliberate authority of a man who has never had the gesture refused, and said, "That's not how this works. You're a guest at this facility. You follow the schedule." The room went quiet. Vega looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at him, and Bowen felt, in the way of a man whose instincts are good even when his judgment is poor, that something had shifted in the air around him. Not in her face, in the air. The specific pressure change that precedes something. She said, "Take your hand off my arm, Sergeant." Her voice was the same temperature it had been when they were talking about wind variance. That was somehow the thing that reached the people nearest them first. Not the words, the temperature. He took his hand off. He did it before he decided to, and that was something he turned over for a long time afterward, because Aldrich Bowen was not a man accustomed to his body making decisions without him. She picked up her field manual. She looked at him with an expression that was not triumph and not anger, and not the careful deference of someone's managing a superior. It was the expression of someone who had already moved on to the next thing and was simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. "I'll attend the next scheduled briefing," she said. "If the updated wind data would be useful to the session, I'll bring it." She went back to her manual. Bowen stood there for 3 seconds, which is a long time to stand somewhere when you're no longer sure why you're there. Then he turned and walked to the serving line and did not look back, because looking back would have been a form of acknowledgement he wasn't ready to make. His NCO, a master corporal named Falk, watched him from the doorway and said nothing. He was 26 years old, 3 years into his career, and he understood precisely what he had just seen, which was a man making a mistake and walking away from it before he'd understood it was a mistake. Falk had seen this before in training environments. It never improved. What happened next unfolded over 4 days in ways that were not dramatic in any individual moment, but were in aggregate the kind of thing that changes a place's understanding of itself. Vega went to the range the following morning at 0530. She went alone, which was unusual enough that the range warden, a civilian employee named Trent Oliver, who had been at Gagetown for 22 years, walked out of his booth to watch what she was doing. What she was doing was setting up at 800 meters and shooting paper at a distance that most service members qualified at only in controlled competition conditions, if at all. She was using a standard issue C-14 Timberwolf, which was not her personal weapon, which meant the rifle was not dialed to her preferences, which meant she had spent the first 20 minutes making adjustments that Oliver, watching through binoculars, could not fully follow because they were too incremental and too precise. Then she shot a group at 800 meters that Oliver, who had seen a great deal of shooting in 22 years, walked out to the target to verify personally because he didn't trust what he'd seen through the glass. He verified it. He stood there in the gray November morning with the target in his hands and made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he walked back to his booth, put the target on his desk, and sat looking at it for a while. He didn't say anything to anyone that day. He was a man who had learned the difference between what he'd witnessed and what he was prepared to claim he'd witnessed until he had more information. What he had witnessed was a group that should not have been possible in the conditions that existed that morning. The wind had changed twice during her firing sequence. She had adjusted both times without visible calculation. The second day, Bowen came to the range at a 700 for his scheduled instruction block. Vega was already there, packing her kit. She had been there since before dawn. He didn't acknowledge her. She didn't acknowledge him. They moved around the range environment with the specific mutual invisibility of two people who have agreed, without discussing it, to pretend the mess hall incident didn't happen. Falk watched this and said nothing. The third day was when Bowen found the target. Oliver had finally pinned it to the board in the range office, with no label, no attribution, no explanation. Just the target. He had been waiting to see how long it would take someone to ask, which was a thing Oliver sometimes did when he wanted to understand what kind of attention a place was paying. Bowen stood in front of the board for a long moment. He was a marksmanship instructor. He understood what he was looking at. He turned to Oliver and said, "Who shot this?" Oliver looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has been asked the question he was waiting for. "Yesterday morning," he said, 800 meters. Wind was shifting 15 to 20 all morning. Bowen looked at the target again. "Who?" he said again. Oliver told him. Bowen was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable. Then he said, "Set up a formal qualification range for tomorrow. Full distance. I want documentation." Oliver looked at him steadily. "Documentation for what purpose?" Bowen didn't answer. He walked out. Falk, who had been in the corner making coffee and pretending not to hear, looked at Oliver. Oliver looked at Falk. Neither of them said anything, because sometimes what needs to be said is already fully present in the silence, and adding words to it would only make it smaller. The qualification range the following morning had an audience that nobody had formally invited. Word had moved through the base the way word moves in small, isolated communities, not loudly, not through announcement, through the particular subterranean current of a place where people live and work in close proximity, and notice what the senior people are paying attention to, and then pay attention to it themselves. There were 14 people at the range by 07 RU. By 0800, when the formal session was scheduled to begin, there were 31. Bowen had not planned for 31 people. He had planned for a documentation exercise. He had planned, if he was being honest with himself in a way that he had not yet managed to be, for an exercise that would find the ceiling he was certain existed. Everyone had a ceiling. The question was where. He had arranged the session marksmanship assessment, standard Canadian marksmanship assessment, standard Canadian forces progression, 100 meters, qualification standards at each. Then, if all went correctly, extended range. He presented this to Vega at the firing line with the professional neutrality of a man who had decided that what was happening here was administrative and not personal, and who was not yet aware that this decision was wrong. She listened. She asked 2 questions about the target configuration. She accepted the C-14 that was handed to her, which was the same rifle she had been using, and checked it with the focused, economical attention of someone for whom equipment verification was a thing that had consequences rather than a form. She shot the 100 meters first. The group was what it was: clean, centered, unhurried. The people watching were experienced enough to recognize competence and quiet enough at that moment to not comment on it. The 200 meters was the same. The 300 meters was the same. Bowen said, "Extended range, 600. Vega moved to the mat, adjusted, shot. Bowen looked through the spotting scope and was quiet for long enough that the man next to him, a lieutenant who had not been introduced, leaned over to look himself. 700, Bowen said. She shot the 700. The 31 people watching had the quality of a group that had stopped thinking about anything other than what was happening in front of them. Not excited exactly. The particular stillness of people witnessing something that is rearranging their working assumptions and doing it so efficiently that there's no space left for noise. 800, Bowen said. The wind had picked up in the last 20 minutes. It was coming off the tree line from the northeast. Vega felt it, and anyone who was watching her face at that moment saw something shift in it, not concern, something more like recognition. Like someone encountering a familiar problem, she made one adjustment. She shot. Bowen walked to the target himself. He walked the full 800 meters and back, which gave him time to decide what he was going to say when he returned, and he still hadn't decided by the time he got back. He stood at the firing line and looked at the group in his hands and looked at Vega and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you train?" "Several places," she said. "Brag." "Then elsewhere." "Elsewhere." "Yes." He held the target. He looked at it again. Not because it would tell him something different than it had told him the first time, but because looking at it gave him somewhere to look that wasn't her face while he recalibrated. Bowen had been doing this for 6 years. He had seen a great deal of shooting. He understood in the quiet of the moment that he was holding something that did not fit in the taxonomy he had built over those 6 years, and that the taxonomy was therefore incomplete, and that the person standing 20 feet away from him was the reason it was incomplete. He put the target down. He looked at her directly. "Sergeant Vega," he said. "Yes, Sergeant." A pause. Around them, 31 people who had stopped breathing waited. "I owe you an apology." He said it clearly, without ornament, the way a person says something they have decided to say and have not wrapped in additional language to soften the cost of saying it. "For the mess hall, what I did was wrong. It had nothing to do with the briefing." Vega looked at him for a moment. Her expression was the same temperature it had been in the mess hall, in the range office, at the target line. Whatever she thought about what he had just said, she did not show it all at once. "Accepted," she said then. "The wind off the northeast corner is going to be a problem for anyone you put at extended range this winter. If you want, I can work up an updated conditions protocol." Bowen looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that was not easy to name. Something that might, in better light, have been the beginning of a different kind of respect from the kind that comes from being in the same place long enough to know the procedures. The kind that has to be earned the hard way, which is the only way it sticks. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." What followed over the next 2 weeks was not a dramatic reconciliation. It was quieter than that and more durable. Vega worked with Bowen on the conditions protocol, and she brought the cold weather adjustments Oliver had been noting for years and never had the institutional backing to formalize, and she worked through them with the same flat precision she brought to everything else. She did not make Bowen feel small in the process. She did not position herself as his corrector. She treated it as a problem they were both looking at, which was a specific social skill that Bowen would eventually recognize as something that took a very long time to develop in someone who had spent years being right in rooms that didn't want her to be. Falk watched all of this with the attention of a young soldier who understands that he is watching something he will draw on later in circumstances he cannot currently anticipate. On the 3rd week, Bowen invited Vega to co-instruct a junior marksmanship block. He presented it to her the way you present things when you're being careful about how you present things, which is to say he led with the practical justification before getting to the actual point. She listened to the practical justification and nodded, and then she said, "I'll need to know their individual site pictures by end of day 1. Can you get me their last qual targets?" He got her the targets. What she did with them was something that the junior soldiers in that block would describe differently, depending on who you asked and how much time had passed. What they agreed on was this. She found the specific mechanical error in each person's process, not the general category of error. The precise location of it, the exact moment in their sequence where the deviation entered the system. And she told each person what it was and how to fix it without telling them what she had seen to find it, which meant they had to go find, which meant they owned the correction in a way they would not have if she had simply handed it to them. By the end of day 3, 2 of the junior soldiers had improved their qualification scores by margins that their previous instructors had told them were unlikely given their current stage of training. This was, in the small world of a winter training base, the kind of thing that moved through the community without needing to be announced. The phone call that changed the shape of what was coming arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 4 weeks into Vega's posting. She was in her quarters writing range notes when the duty officer knocked and said she had a call from a number that had been routed through several exchanges, which was a specific kind of call at a base like Gagetown, and which told Vega before she picked up exactly what category of conversation she was about to have. She picked up. She listened for 40 seconds. She said 3 words. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. The call was from a contact whose name she did not use over routed lines, but whose voice she would have recognized in a great deal of noise. He had told her that an operational assessment she had submitted 14 months ago, through channels that had returned no acknowledgement, had been reviewed. It had been reviewed at a level she had not anticipated, and the unit that had reviewed it had questions, not the administrative kind. The kind that meant someone, somewhere, had read what she had written and understood what it contained. She had written that assessment after her second deployment in the particular clarity of a person who has seen something wrong and cannot unsee it. The assessment was about targeting methodology, about the gap between the intelligence architecture and the decisions it was being used to support, and the specific documentable ways that gap was costing people in the field. She had written it with the precision she brought to everything, and she had routed it upward and heard nothing, and had concluded, eventually, that it had gone into the same silence that absorbed most things written by people at her level about problems at the level above them. It had not gone into silence. It had gone to a desk where it had sat for 14 months, while someone decided what to do with a document that was correct in every material detail and inconvenient in every political one. She didn't know yet what the questions meant. She didn't know if they were the kind of questions that opened doors or the kind that closed them. She knew that 14 months was a long time for someone to be deciding, and that the length of the deliberation said something about the weight of what she'd written, and that the weight, one way or another, had finally moved. She went to the range the next morning at 0530. Oliver was already there. He handed her a coffee without being asked and went back to his booth, which was the exact right response to what she was carrying and the exact thing he had no way of knowing she needed. She drank the coffee and set up at 600 meters because the light wasn't right yet for 800. She shot for an hour in the gray November dawn, not thinking about the call, not thinking about the assessment or the desk it had sat on for 14 months, just doing the thing that her hands knew how to do, the thing that required full presence and allowed nothing else. This was why she came to the range at 0530, not for the scores, for the quiet. When Bowen arrived at 0700, she was packing her kit. She had the look he had come to recognize over 4 weeks as her post-range look, which was less settled than her baseline, not more, because she came to the range wound and left unwound, and the unwound was not relaxed but clear. There was a difference, and he had taken 3 weeks to understand it. He nodded at her. She nodded back. He said, "I got the format for the updated protocol approved. We can run it through the training cycle starting January." "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not because anything in her face had announced itself, but because he had spent 4 weeks recalibrating his read of her, and he was better at it now. "Something's up," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "A thing I wrote," she said after a moment, 14 months ago. "Someone read it, good thing or bad thing." She picked up her kit. "I'll know when I know." He watched her walk toward the road and thought about that. He thought about the assessment she had done of the northeast wind, which had also sat for a long time before someone did something with it, and which was now going to be formalized into the training cycle because she had refused, without refusing, to accept that silence was the same as wrong. Falk appeared at his elbow with the morning's range schedule. Bowen took it without looking away from the road where Vega had gone. "You know what she put in that protocol?" Bowen said, not quite a question. "The updated conditions document, the adjustments." "Some of them," Falk said. "She had the data, all of it from the first week." He paused. She'd been at the range at 0530 every morning since she arrived. She knew what the conditions were doing before she ever shot a formal assessment. Falk said nothing, which was the range schedule in his hand. Bowen looked at the range schedule. He said, "She was waiting for me to ask." He had not asked for 4 weeks. She had waited, and in the waiting she had not become impatient, had not repeated herself, had not escalated what she knew into a weapon. She had simply continued to show up at 0530 and do the work and wait for the moment when the work would speak for itself. That was, Bowen understood now, the discipline. Not the marksmanship. The marksmanship was what it was, and it was extraordinary, but extraordinary marksmanship was a skill. What she had done in 4 weeks at Gagetown was something different. She had held her knowledge and her patience and her corrections in equal balance and let the situation develop at the pace the situation required and not at the pace her frustration might have demanded. He had, in the mess hall on day 11, grabbed her arm she had told him to let go. And then she had come back the next morning at 0530 and done the work. The call from Washington came through the base commander's office the following Monday. Vega was in the middle of an instruction block with 6 junior soldiers when she was told she was needed. She finished the instruction block first. The duty sergeant who had delivered the message waited with the patience of someone who had been told that waiting was the correct response. When she arrived at the commander's office, there were 2 people she didn't recognize and one she did. The one she recognized was a colonel she had last seen at Bragg in a conference room on the day she had submitted her assessment through the formal channel that had returned no acknowledgement. He looked the same. She probably didn't. 14 months and 2 deployments and a posting to a gray November base at the edge of New Brunswick had a way of settling into a person's face. "Sergeant Vega," the colonel said, "we have some questions about your targeting methodology assessment." She sat down. She had been sitting down in rooms with difficult questions for 11 years, and she had the quality in those moments of a person for whom the chair and the room and the people in it are simply the context for a problem she has already looked at from most of the available angles. "All right," she said. What followed was 2 hours of conversation that was not a deposition and not an interview and not quite either of those things, but had elements of both. They asked her about the assessment. They asked her about the gaps she had documented. They asked her about the 14 specific incidents she had flagged and the data she had used to flag them and the methodology she had applied to determine that the gap was structural rather than incidental. She answered every question. She answered them the way she shot, which is to say with the kind of precision that comes from having thought about the problem so many times that the answer is no longer something you retrieve but something you inhabit. When they got to the last section of the assessment, the recommendations, the colonel looked at her over the document. This would require a significant restructuring of how intelligence is translated to targeting decisions at the operational level. "Yes," she said. "You understand that what you're proposing is not a small adjustment. I understand that," she said. "I also understand that the 14 incidents I documented represent a pattern that is going to continue to produce the same outcomes until the gap is addressed. The assessment doesn't say it's easy, it says it's necessary." The colonel looked at her for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. He said, "There are 3 other analysts who've been working on adjacent problems for the past 8 months. They came to similar conclusions through different methodologies. Your document was the first one that produced an actionable framework." She sat with that for a moment. 8 months, she said. From a different entry point. They weren't in the field when you were. They were looking at the data after the fact. She thought about the range, about the difference between looking at the data from outside and being the person at the firing point when the wind shifted twice during the sequence. She thought about the 14 months the assessment had sat on a desk while she had gone to 2 more deployments and a November posting and 0530 mornings in the cold, and the work of continuing to be the person who submitted correct documents and waited for the world to catch up to them. "What do you need from me?" she said. What they needed was a working group. 4 months, Washington, and then field evaluation. They told her this with the careful specificity of people who have been authorized to ask a specific question and need a specific answer. She thought about Oliver and his 22 years and the targets he had pinned to the board without attribution. She thought about Bowen and his taxonomy and the moment his hand had left her arm before he decided to let go. She thought about Falk watching from the doorway with the quiet attention of someone learning how things worked. She thought about the 6 junior soldiers she had left in the middle of an instruction block to come to this meeting. She thought about what she'd told them that morning about sight pictures, about the difference between knowing where to aim and understanding why the aim needs to move. "Yes," she said, "I'll do it." The colonel nodded once. The 2 people she didn't recognize made notes. When she walked out of the commander's office, Bowen was waiting in the corridor. This surprised her. She didn't show it, but it surprised her because there was no administrative reason for him to be there, and he was not a man who showed up places without administrative reason. He stood when she came out. He didn't ask anything. He just looked at her with the face of a man who has come to understand, over 4 weeks of recalibration, that this person he had misjudged in the mess hall had been carrying something that was considerably larger than a transfer posting, and who had come to wait in a corridor without knowing why, except that it seemed like the right thing to do. She looked at him. She said, 4 months, then I'll be back. He nodded. The protocol will be in the training cycle by then. Good. She paused. A moment that had more in it than either of them had the language for right then, which was fine. Some things find their language later, she said. You run a good range, Bowen, when you're not grabbing people. He looked at the floor for a moment and then looked back at her. Working on it, he said. She walked down the corridor toward the exit. Outside, Oliver was crossing the yard toward the range office with a stack of target paper under one arm. He saw her coming and changed directions slightly, so their paths crossed, which was a thing a person does when they want to say something and aren't sure if the moment is right. Here you're leaving, he said. 4 months. He nodded. He looked at the ground the way he had looked at targets, the way he looked at things he was taking a full accounting of. That protocol, he said, the updated conditions document. I had notes going back 6 years. Nobody ever. He stopped. It was good work, he said. What you did with those notes. The data was already there, she said. You'd been collecting it. Yeah, well. He shifted the target paper under his arm. Collecting it doesn't mean much if it just sits in a drawer. She looked at him. He looked back, and for a moment, they were simply two people standing in a cold yard on a gray November morning who understood each other on the specific topic of what it costs to know something correctly for a long time before the world is ready to confirm it. Keep collecting it, she said. Someone will always need it eventually. She went to finish packing. In the range office that afternoon, Oliver pinned a new piece of paper to the board next to the unmarked target. This one he labeled. Name, date, distance, conditions. He wrote it in the careful block letters of a man making a formal record because the thing being documented deserved to be documented properly, and the person who had done it deserved to have her name attached to what she had done. He stepped back and looked at both sheets on the board. Then he made coffee and went back to work, because the range needed maintaining and the morning came early, and there was no shortage of things that still needed doing.